Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming. This is the first talk of the Tower Center's academic year, the first of many talks. We will be having a very exciting program this year. We're packed to the gills already, and there's more to follow. This is our first event, so don't screw it up. Right?
That's a big responsibility.
No mistakes. If you're new to the Tower Center, welcome. We do a range of events on all sorts of things related to political studies. We do issues relating to regional politics, like what you'll hear today, and Chinese politics. We do issues on the Middle East quite a lot. We do issues on national security and political economy and a range of things. We're also doing some interesting new programming this year. For instance, on the evening of October 1st, we're doing a collaborative program with the Meadows Museum on the relation between art and politics. This has been in the news recently for all the wrong reasons. The tragic events in Syria come to mind, and so we're going to do a big program in collaboration with the director of the Meadows Museum on this issue of art and power and the destruction of antiquities for political purposes. In addition, we've got a lot of other upcoming events before we even get to October. Next week, we have Ambassador Robert Jordan, our diplomat in residence, will be speaking on his memoir about his time as ambassador to Saudi Arabia. Our own Hiroki Takeuchi will be giving a talk on Wednesday about his recent book, which is fabulous. And we're doing other events as well on Chinese politics, Asian politics, and the Persian Gulf. That's our focus for the next month or so. And then a lot more to follow after that. I will shut up now. I'm going to hand the floor over to Professor Takeuchi, who's the director of our Sun and Star program on Japan and East Asia here at the Tower Center. Hiroki.
All right. I'm very pleased with introducing you a very good friend of mine, Danny Stockman. This is the first program of the newly established program of Sun Star Speaker Series on Japan and East Asia. When I tried to convince Japan Foundation, who is sponsoring this program, to include the specialists on China in the speaker series of Japan and East Asia. I say that it's important to understand what's going on in Chinese domestic politics to understand U.S.-Japan relationship. And then Danny I cannot imagine that anybody who is better than Danny to be the first speaker of that series. So she is currently associate professor in the Institute of Political Science at Leiden University in the Netherlands. She received the 2015 Goldsmith Book Prize for her book, which she is going to talk about, Media Commercialization and Authoritarian Rule in China, awarded by Harvard University's Shorenstein Center on Media Politics and Public Policy for the, quote, academic book published in the United States in the last 24 months that best fulfills the objective of improving democratic governance through an examination of the intersection between the media, politics, and public policy. And this is a terrific accomplishment, I would say, because she is recognized beyond the China field. And I recommend anybody who is interested in China to read the book. And that book makes the study of Chinese politics really interesting, and it represents the how stimulating the current state of the study of Chinese politics is. Her research interests include Chinese politics, political communication, and political psychology, and she applies theories and methods developed in those fields on authoritarian politics, putting China in the comparative perspective. Her recent research is a new project tracing the impact of social media on authoritarian politics. So please join me for welcoming Dr. Danny Stockman.
Well, thank you, Hiroki, and thank you for inviting me to the Tower Center seminar. I'm delighted to be here today. So whenever I talk outside of China about Chinese media, usually the first thing that comes to mind when we think about Chinese media, television, cell phones, there's the newspapers, and also the Chinese citizens who read those newspapers, is usually state control and censorship. So today, when I opened the newspaper, there was a story about a reporter. His name is Wang Xiaolü from Caijing magazine, who was arrested recently because of his reporting on the stock market. And those kinds of reports are very frequent when you read about Chinese media abroad. Well, what is very surprising, maybe, when you go to China and you talk to the people on these pictures who read and watch and listen Chinese media, but also when you talk to reporters in China, they usually don't see censorship and control as the main topic. Of course, they know that Chinese media are censored to a certain extent, but they usually emphasize freedom and space for news reporting. So in my research, I'm really intrigued by this apparent contradiction between, on the one hand, state control over media in China, but then on the other hand, press freedom or perceptions of press freedom in China. And so my talk today is based on my book, which explains how this apparent contradiction between control on the one hand and perceptions of media freedom together make the Chinese propaganda system work. And I argue that it's precisely because the Chinese media system has these two distinguishing features that it actually works out to the advantage of the Chinese state. And as I found out during the course of this project, the introduction of market forces in media in China actually play a very strong role in how propaganda works. Well, in most liberal democracies, advertising is taken for granted, but in many authoritarian regimes like China, advertising and also investment into media represent a radical break from the past. Because media in those states used to be completely state-owned, and they used to be completely financed by state subsidies. But since about 1970, many authoritarian regimes have marketized their media. And so China really follows this general trend towards the marketization of media. And this marketization includes three processes: deregulation, commercialization, and partial privatization. So deregulation provides media outlets with greater authority over programming decisions. And commercialization usually includes a shift from being funded completely with state subsidies towards being primarily funded through advertising. And then the third process is partial privatization, whereby property is transferred from public to private ownership. And in China, as in many other authoritarian regimes, this privatization process is only partial, because in China only 49% can be invested by non-state sources, and the remaining 51% belong to the Chinese Communist Party, actually not to the Chinese state. So the question that emerges from this trend towards media marketization in authoritarian states is, what are the consequences of media marketization for authoritarian rule? And this is the main question that I pose in the book. And currently, there are two answers that have emerged in the scholarly discussion here. So most studies in comparative politics explicitly or implicitly argue that media marketization will eventually lead to the breakdown of authoritarian rule and possibly even bring about democracy. So according to this first argument, the media become more dependent on their audiences as they become more commercialized, because advertising agencies care about the size and the characteristics of media audiences. And as dependency on advertising increases, the media then produce more diverse political messages in the press, and this is said to give political opponents a greater voice, and thus eroding the regime's legitimacy and also destabilizing the regime. Another argument is that media independence contributes to the liberalization of political culture, and therefore also the emergence of a public sphere, thus eventually bringing about democracy in those states. Well, in practice, that's not what we are observing in many states like China and Russia. So recently, another argument has emerged which emphasizes authoritarian resilience. So here, China and Russia scholars argue that media marketization actually strengthens the stability of regimes, as increased funding by advertisers and investors actually promote control over media as opposed to eroding it. And so the answers that emerge in my book explain why scholarship about the consequences of media marketization has actually come to these two apparently opposing conclusions. So in my view, the marketization and authoritarian state contains both liberalization and control. And it leads to different outcomes depending on whether the state can maintain the delicate balance between the two. So media marketization requires a certain degree of liberalization because media need to cater towards audiences in order to make a profit. But at the same time, this increased social space places pressure on authoritarian states. And only if the state maintains the capacity to control media and deal with the pressures can media marketization stabilize the regime. And to develop this argument, I draw on a new approach called responsive authoritarianism that is emerging out of the China field. And in the remainder of my talk, I'm going to provide you with an insight into the core of this argument. So first, I'm going to explain the analytical framework of responsive authoritarianism today, and then I'll walk you very briefly through the research design, and then finally I'm going to close with a short empirical example to illustrate how this works. How does the balance between liberalization and control together produce stability? So, responsive authoritarianism. So, to understand this new approach to study state-society relations, it's helpful to look into what's called the dictator's dilemma, which lays out one of the fundamental assumptions about how authoritarian rulers govern their citizens. So, the dictator's dilemma refers to, as formulated by Wintrobe 1998, it refers to the problem of knowing how much support an authoritarian leader has among citizens. And so the main idea here is that the use of repression breeds fear on the part of citizens, and therefore citizens are reluctant to speak out their true opinions, especially when they're dissatisfied with politics. And because the dictator cannot rely on public opinion, he becomes very uncertain and uses even more fear to rule its citizens, which then magnifies the problem. And in research on authoritarian politics, the main solution to this so-called dictator's dilemma is that the so-called distribution of economic benefits in exchange for political support. So, according to this understanding of authoritarian politics, rulers then overcome this problem by overpaying supporters and kind of buying the loyalty among its citizens. They distribute private and public goods, such as they may provide job security, they may lower taxes, and they also implement some policies that distribute wealth more equally amongst society in some states. So this is pretty much how far our current understanding of authoritarian politics goes. We assume that citizens are either secretly opposing authoritarianism, but are afraid to speak out, or they benefit economically from the regime and therefore they support the authoritarian system. So in my book, I argue that this understanding of authoritarian politics is outdated. Certain kinds of authoritarian regimes have developed so-called input institutions that allow them to arrive at high levels of public support without openly enforcing their preferences on citizens. And this is the so-called responsive authoritarianism model. So this approach mainly develops out of the China field. Responsive authoritarianism emphasizes that authoritarian regimes, they can develop so-called feedback mechanisms, also called input institutions, by using elections, petitioning, social organizations, and I argue in the book media also constitute an input institution. And through these sort of social spaces that are created, the authoritarian ruler reduces the need to rely on repression. But for the system to work, the authoritarian state needs to retain a certain degree of control. So this cannot work in the absence of strong institutions that have the capacity to enforce control. And So to avoid the breakdown of the system, you need to walk a fine line between the opening of these spaces, these sort of feedback or input institutions, while also enforcing state control through strong institutions. And so in the book, I expand on this problem of this tension between social space and state control under responsive authoritarianism. And so the book explores these effects with respect to media, and especially the effects of the marketization of media on the production of news, up here, and also on media credibility. So let's first take a closer look at the production of news. That's in the upper part of this figure. So I find that the Chinese state is able to synchronize news content and retain roughly uniform political messages in the news. So it's able to do this because of this interaction between market mechanisms and institutions, most importantly the so-called propaganda department. There are several other institutions, but the propaganda department is key to this story. So let's first take a quick look at what I call tolerance of social space in Chinese media here on the left side of the circle. So to a certain extent, media marketization requires liberalization because media outlets need to be able to respond to audience demands in order to attract advertising. But the state allows this space to emerge primarily when the interests between state and society converge. There's simply no need to control news content when market demands already pull media into the desired direction. So you can strategically make use of market forces to pull media into the direction that are in line with your policies. At the same time, the opening of this space also creates tension between the journalists and the editors in these media outlets and the propaganda officials, because audiences do not always demand the kind of stories that the state wants the media to produce. So when market demands pull media away from the position of the state then issues restrictions as a means of control, here indicated on the right side here, this part of the circle. So one of the main advantages of this selective or strategic opening and closing of space for news reporting is that it allows the media to function as input institutions. And it's by this interaction through the communication that happens between the journalists that are arguing for more freedom and the propaganda officials that are trying to convince the journalists to control news content. Through this interaction, the state actually learns about public opinion and gains feedback from citizens. So far I've talked about how market mechanisms allow media to function as input institutions. Let me now turn to the other part of the book, which is about the credibility. So to what extent can media actually persuade the citizens who read those media? Here, the core finding of the book is that the market-based media boost the credibility in China. And this is so because the marketization of media changes people's perceptions of media sources. So although the content itself is roughly on average in line with the official line of the state, the media, if they cannot push the line, they use all sorts of branding strategies to brand themselves as what they call representatives of the people, and also media outlets that publish truthful, credible information. And these brands, or what's called media labels, also in communications, are rooted in real differences between media outlets, but at the same time the branding strategies of the market-based media kind of exaggerate these differences. And together then, the perceptions of trustworthy information in combination with the perceived representativeness creates the perception of a credible media outlet. So media credibility then matters in turn for the kind of media that people like to consume, and also the kind of media that people find convincing. And I'm going to illustrate in a moment how this works in practice. So together then, because the media here, the production makes sure that media is on average, so not always, but on average in line with state policies. But at the same time, the market-based media lead to greater consumption and also greater persuasion of media. Together, then this stabilizes the system. And I have some ideas about how this changes over time. I can talk more about this during the discussion. So what's important here then is also the question as to how representative is the Chinese system. So if you start to compare China with other states, what you'll find is that China is by no means one of the only authoritarian states that actually uses institutions to constrain news reporting. So there are other places, such as Tanzania, for example, in Africa, that also tend to impose restrictions on media. Unfortunately, a lot of the organizations that observe media freedom, like Freedom House, for example, they don't collect that kind of information. So it was quite difficult to figure that out in practice, what kind of states do have these states. When you then look at how these institutions relate to the political systems, you find that one-party regimes tend to be more likely to have this institutional capacity to control media content and practice than other types of regimes. So I find that the regime type mitigates the effects of media marketization on support for the regime. One-party regimes can use media marketization to their advantage, but other kinds of regimes, for example, a lot of the regimes in the Middle East are personalist regimes. In Africa, there are a lot of military regimes. Those are other kinds of regimes that tend to not build strong institutions, and therefore they tend to have less capacity to impose state control in practice. So marketized media is said to have played a great role, a very strong role during the recent Arab Spring protests, for example. So my research proposes that one reason why market-based media may have played a stronger role in these uprisings in the Middle East compared to China is that in most of these countries, Tunisia, Egypt, they're not one single party systems. They don't have strong institutions, and therefore the states couldn't use market-based media to their own advantage. So that means that the figure I showed you earlier displays the mechanisms here for how the state media and audiences together explain how propaganda works not only in China, but I think also in other kinds of one-party regimes. So next, let me just briefly explain to you the research design and then go into an empirical example. So this is a map of mainland China displaying advertising income per province, which is a good measure of the degree to which local media are commercialized. And in the book, my focus is on newspapers, which constitute the second most popular media among urban citizens, right after television. You would be surprised that about 80% of Chinese urban citizens still read newspapers, although increasingly they're moving towards reading them online. So because Chinese newspapers are, newspaper markets are extremely fragmented in China and very regional. And because they're located in urban areas, I rely on a comparison between cities that differ in terms of their level of media marketization. So I spent 12 months of fieldwork in Beijing and in Chongqing, and then I complemented these data from 3 more cities, Shenyang in Liaoning, and Wuxi in Jiangsu, and Foshan in Guangdong. And these cities all differ in terms of their level of media marketization, but also in terms of their administrative status that they have. And so this allows me to draw some conclusions about China as a whole. And in the book, I also have some cross-regional comparison to test whether the findings that mainly emerge out of the comparison between Beijing and Chongqing actually apply more broadly. And they do. For the research design, I used multiple methods, including interviews with many media practitioners, including content analysis of over 2,000 newspaper articles, public opinion surveys, also some experiments, and also a cross-country comparison of China with 37 other authoritarian states in Africa, the post-Soviet region, and also the Middle East. So let me just briefly point out a few aspects that are significant about these data. Because if you are, let's say, if you're working on American politics, it's much easier to obtain these data. And so I want to just briefly explain to you what's sort of new about them. So when I started this project, actually nobody else had done a large-scale content analysis or had studied any media effects in China. So the book contains, so all of the data I had to collect myself. The book contains the first large-scale computer-aided text analysis of over 2,000 articles. It's also the first study of media effects using experiments in China, demonstrating the causal relationship between reading certain newspapers and the effects on people's attitudes. And it's also unique among studies of Chinese media in that it places China into a broader comparative context. So a lot of Chinese media research focuses on China or specific case studies inside China, which are very important, but sometimes we lose track of the overall picture. And so by placing China into a broader comparative context, I could learn a little bit more about the institutions and how one-party regimes matter. And so the book also systematically compares two issue areas. One is related to domestic politics, the other to foreign politics. So in terms of domestic politics, I focus on labor issues. You may have read about the Foxconn scandals. Chinese workers are frequently protesting in the streets, and I looked at how newspapers reported about these issues and how it mattered for how Chinese citizens viewed those issues. And then I also I looked at how the Chinese press influences Chinese views of the United States and also other countries. Because as it happens, this is a picture from the anti-Japanese protests in 2005, which is the example that I chose to discuss today, also in light of the general theme of the speaker series. So it just so happened that when I was in the field in 2005, and when we were in the process of conducting a survey, by chance the anti-Japanese protests happened. And while this was very unfortunate, obviously, for the Japanese citizens living in China, I thought I had caught a lucky break because I realized that this provided a unique opportunity to observe how people reacted to changes in the way that the government handled media reporting regards Japan. And so I want to share my results from the 2005 protests with you today. Later on, you may remember in 2012, there were also anti-Japanese protests regarding the Diaoyu Senkaku Island disputes in the South China Sea in China. So we can talk more about what may have changed. In practice, in my opinion, there's a lot of continuity. So a lot of the dynamics that I'm going to talk to you about from 2005 actually also applied to social media and new media today. So let me first talk a little bit more about this issue area of Chinese nationalism. So nationalism has become a so-called, what we call a double-edged sword to the Chinese leadership. On the one hand, in the 1990s, Jiang Zemin propagated nationalism as a substitute for the decline in socialist ideology, and the party looks at nationalism to a certain extent as improving the party's legitimacy. But then in the early 2000s, popular nationalism started to pose pressures and constraints on the Chinese leadership. This is so with respect to American politics, that's the case because China is actually the Chinese government at least is seeking a positive relationship with the United States. And although obviously there are some conflicts, in general, the attitude of the Chinese government is very cooperative, while public opinion tends to push for a more assertive stance on Chinese leaders. So the Chinese leadership increasingly feels under pressure of popular nationalism. So for example, here in these pictures, these protesters, this is from the anti-Japanese protests in 2005 here, the protesters demand China say no. That's a popular book in China, 中国可以说不, which was very critical regarding Japan. And then you have some citizens demanding defeat Japanese imperialism. People are demanding on this picture Chinese support Chinese products. Boycott Japanese products. So these are slogans that frequently come out during anti-Japanese protests. So in response to these pressures, then the propaganda department has tried to pull public opinion towards Japan and also the US in a more positive, more moderate direction in recent years. And the government therefore tries to use media as a tool to massage public opinion. And this general tendency has one exception, and that is during a crisis. And so let me show you how this worked in case of the anti-Japanese protests. So this figure here is a timeline of the events that occurred between March and May 2005, which is roughly the time period when we do the survey in Beijing. And in March and April, political ties between China and Japan became strained over several issues. Most importantly, you may remember there was a high school history textbook that was approved by the Japanese Ministry of Education at the time, and that was in China and also in Korea interpreted as whitewashing Japanese war crimes during the occupation in the 1930s and also 1940s. And so throughout this period, we were simultaneously conducting the survey, but also I was doing interviews with editors and journalists, so I could really observe how state control specific directives of the propaganda department, that I could observe the point in time when they reached newspapers and when editors started to feel more controlled. So what was very interesting was that in the very beginning, there was a period when basically the state abstained from controlling any reports about Japan. So all the editors that I talked to felt free to talk about Japan and this issue in any way they liked. But then, after the first protest took place in Beijing, in response to the approval of the textbooks, the propaganda department quickly issued instructions. So that was only after the first protest happened. And then asked the media to tone down its criticism of Japan. And the reason why the propaganda department held a very tight grip on media throughout this entire period was that in late April, mid to late April, the Japanese foreign minister was expected in Beijing in order to participate in the Asia-Europe meeting. And then also afterwards, two very important visitors from Taiwan were expected. Among them was Lian Zhan, who was at the time the nationalist leader of the KMT, and it was the first time that he officially visited mainland China since they had left to Taiwan in 1949. So this was a really big event. So press restrictions then continued throughout these visits. And I'll show you in a moment how Beijing newspapers responded to these changes. But before I do so, I just want to give you a quick overview of how the Beijing newspaper market looks like. So this figure is based on my interviews with editors and journalists in Beijing. And during the interviews, I asked what the expressions official, semi-official, and commercialized papers meant to them. So in Chinese, that's 官方、半官方 and 市场化媒体. And I then showed them a list of major newspapers in Beijing and asked them to categorize each of these newspapers for me. And then I averaged across these responses. And the result of this question is here, down here on the x-axis. And you can see that in Beijing, there are 3 types of newspapers. On the one side, you have the commercialized papers. These are papers that tend to be funded through advertising, but they also have some investment. On the other side of the spectrum, up here, you have so-called official papers, which receive some form of state subsidies, and then you have some papers in the middle which lack investment, but they're completely funded through advertising. So I want to draw your attention here to the blue and the green dot in the figure. The blue dot is the People's Daily, also the mouthpiece of the central level Chinese Communist Party, and it's an official paper. And the green dot is the so-called Beijing Youth Daily, which falls somewhere in between semi-official and commercialized. And then you have the y-axis here. It's just a question where I asked how much space editors and journalists perceive these newspapers to have. So you can see that there's a direct relationship between media marketization and perceived space. So next I want to show you how these different newspapers reacted to the changes in media management before and after April 9th. And this is also the treatment of my quasi-experiment in the survey. So the results of the content analysis of newspaper reporting in the People's Daily and the Beijing Youth Daily here, which was the blue and the green dot in the earlier figure, is displayed in this figure. And you can see that these results are actually very typical of China's management of media during these crisis situations. So increasingly, Chinese media are undergoing what Chinese communication scholars call 论危机, or it's a public opinion crisis. And these public opinion crises refer to cycles where media are mobilizing public opinion. And then these media mobilization is spilling over into actual political actions, then placing pressure on the government. And then in the context of foreign politics, public mobilization occurs when the propaganda department abstains from giving directions. So they give space. And because negative news sells well, and because editors and journalists believe that Chinese audiences want to read negative news about Japan, then media go very negative, as you can see here. Both of these newspapers go very negative. But then when the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs decided to massage media, after about April 10th, you can see that both newspapers, they're still negative, but they're much more moderate and much more neutral. So they move into a more positive direction. And you can also see that while in the period when they were not constrained, there were some differences, with the official paper being somewhat more closer to the official line, while the commercialized paper is a bit more negative. Here, there's almost no difference between the two. So here, this is what I call synchronization. Here, they're really synchronized. So, so with this in mind, let's take a look at what happens when people read these papers. So, so the data is based on a survey that was done using PPS random sampling, and it's a face-to-face survey conducted by trained university students, and the response rate was about 56%. And to detect media effects, I examined the interaction between reading newspapers and in the period before and after April 9th. The dependent variable is a feeling thermometer towards Japan, running from 1 to 100. Higher values represent warmer feelings. And the variable press restrictions here is a dummy variable that was coded 1 if the interview was conducted after press restrictions were imposed. So the other independent variable, exposure, is measured by a scale that takes into account how many newspapers people read, because Chinese newspapers it's a rapidly changing media environment. It's very different than in most advanced industrialized democracies. Chinese readers tend to read a very broad set of newspapers. They don't have one particular newspaper that they read. They go to the newspaper stand and they select whatever they find interesting. So I was taking into account how many newspapers people read, and so the variable then measures to what extent, on average, people read commercialized papers, or to what extent, on average, they tend to read more official papers. And so here, 0 represents reading official papers, and 1, the higher number, it is the more likely you are to read commercialized papers. So my hypothesis here is that the interaction term should be positive, because news content moved into a positive direction, and people's feelings towards Japan should be pulled into a more positive direction as people read those messages in commercialized papers particularly. So before I show you the results, let me just briefly mention that this model assumes that people were at least moderately attentive. In research on political communication, we have found that in order to be influenced by media, you have to at least pay some attention to the issue. Because if you read the newspaper and you read sports, only the sports section, you're actually never going to read anything about Japan. So I don't have any measures about people's attentiveness here, but the assumption is that in a period in Beijing where a lot of protests happened regarding Japan, I think it's reasonable to assume that people paid at least some attention towards this issue. So this table shows the main results of the statistical analysis. I show you a figure illustrating the results in a moment. Just want to show you that these findings, the interaction term here is supporting the hypothesis, but it's actually not statistically significant, and I can talk more about this in detail during the discussion. The reason is that the number of people who were interviewed after April was relatively small, so there's no significant 95% significance here. But in general, the findings support the story. So this figure shows then how people's sentiment towards Japan changes before and after press restrictions are imposed, depending on whether they read on average commercialized papers. And so what you see is the x-axis here compares the time period before and after April, and the y-axis shows how warmly you feel towards Japan. And I want to draw your attention to 2 effects here. So first, readers' opinions become more uniform after press restrictions were imposed. So by that I mean they move closer together. So here they're wider, the distance is wider, and here they're closer together. So before April 9, readers of commercialized papers felt about 14 degrees more negative towards Japan than readers of official papers. And just to give you a sense of how much that is, your national identity, as we measure it in the survey, makes about 12 degrees of a difference. So this means media have about the same power as a person's national identity or strength of your national identity. That's a very strong effect. And what you see is that after April 9th, there is less of a difference between the readers of the commercialized and the official papers. So the distance between the dotted and the solid line, it just decreases. And then the second key finding here is that the commercialized media were also able to appease citizens. So the anti-Japanese protest induced, of course, a sense of crisis amongst Beijingers. So overall, readers generally move into a cooler direction here. But you can see that this effect for people who read the commercialized papers is almost insignificant. They stay basically at the same level, while people who read the official papers are less convinced by the positive or more moderate messages in the news. Remember, the content analysis shows that the content is moving into a more positive direction, so they actually become more negative over time. So to conclude, because I know you have a lot of questions, let me just briefly summarize what I've told you so far about how propaganda in China works under a marketized environment. So responsive authoritarianism in Chinese media, in my opinion, requires a certain degree of social space. And this increase of autonomy of media outlets is associated with the marketization of media. Media marketization opens up the space for social forces to influence the production of news. But at the same time, this increased space also leads to tension between the propaganda officials and the social actors, in this case editors and journalists, who are producing the content. Although the Chinese state has the capacity, so it does retain the capacity to synchronize news when needed, this increased autonomy of news reporting as well as the media branding strategies of newspapers then boost the credibility of newspapers in China. And this credibility boost allows Chinese media to actually be effective in disseminating information and guiding public opinion. So overall, media marketization, in my opinion, stabilizes the political system rather than undermining it. So I want to stop here. I'm sure you have lots of questions, and I'm looking forward to them. Thank you.
Run Q&A. I'll run Q&A. If you have a question, please raise your hand. But I am going to take the prerogative and ask the first question. I have like a zillion questions. That was fascinating. But I'll just ask one. Journalists and editors, are they aware of what game is being played here? Right? I mean, presumably they're just smart people and savvy people. Do they know that they're sort of being used as this alternative mechanism for the party to stay in power without having to crack heads too often? And if they are aware of it, why do they go along with it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question.
And so Thomas has to teach at 2 p.m. and you have a question.
Oh yeah, thank you very much. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much for this presentation. You said that the state needs to strike a delicate balance between tolerance and control. And maybe my question is a little bit out of the scope of your study, but I was wondering if you saw an evolution over time in terms of striking this balance regarding political events which could potentially strike a blow against the very legitimacy of the regime. So I'm thinking, for example, about the anniversary of the Tiananmen massacre. I'm thinking about the Nobel Peace Prize awarded to Liu Xiaobo. So if you had any take on this evolution over time. Thank you.
Answer his question and then yours.
Okay, all right. So the evolution over time. So China undergoes fairly regular cycles, and these cycles don't correspond to elections as in democracies, but they actually correspond to the way in which China changes its leadership. So you can, if you follow how much sensitive information manages to be placed in a newspaper like the People's Daily, which is the most controlled newspaper in China, what you find is that during periods where there's leadership change, so for example when Xi Jinping at the moment is still in the very beginning phase of his rule, so during these phases Chinese leaders tend to be more restrictive of media. So the same, you may remember 10 years ago when Hu Jintao first came to power, during the first few years, you may maybe remember the SARS crisis. Hu Jintao also cracked down very severely on Chinese media. That's the case because at that point in time, the party is still somewhat divided. And when there is leadership division, the central leadership at least is more insecure. And then during the kind of the middle years of these cycles, the leadership generally tends to open up more. While then towards the end, when there's a new leader emerging on the horizon, it kind of goes down. So there are kind of 10-year cycles that you can observe, but then there's also a yearly and annual cycle. So you have every year in March there are the two meetings, the so-called Lianghui meetings, and during this time also media space is much more tightly controlled. While then towards the end of the year, especially the spring festival period, media tend to be more open. So there are these there's kind of a fair maybe there's more regularity to these opening and closing of spaces, but then you also have specific events that just emerge, right? And how these events are controlled depend on how they relate to the official positions. There is overall, with the emergence of social media and new media as a very quick way in which information can be distributed, there is a tendency for leaders to have to allow a certain degree of news reporting. So they have moved over time away from just asking media to completely abstain. So for example, regarding the stock market crisis in China, for example, the propaganda directives have not been, don't cover it, which would have been a directive of the past, but instead they try to manipulate the message. So they say, cover it, but make sure that you're not too pessimistic about it, that you keep people in a positive mode, and they try to control the message. They also try to do more public relations, use more public relations strategies to be more manipulative. And then that kind of relates to the question as to how why do smart intellectuals who become editors and journalists, why do they play this role? And so what you find is that this currently, even though I wasn't surprised that Xi Jinping cracked down on the media, the extent to which he does it is much stricter compared to the Hu Jintao era, and a lot of journalists are quitting their jobs. And the reason is precisely because they have, a lot of the journalists that I talk to have lost hope that they can actually make a difference. So as long as you can, in this sort of game that you play between, sometimes allowing journalists to do investigative reporting and sometimes restricting it, if you give media a certain degree of hope that they can make a difference, and they feel that sometimes there's a success story that they can sort of hang on to, it has worked during the Hu and Wen years.
You've got to massage the media first, and then
exactly. But increasingly, it's not convincing anymore. So a lot of journalists are quitting and decide to move in other, do business, do something more boring, maybe less exciting, but or maybe more exciting, who knows? But not having a social impact, maybe as much.
All right, I will throw it up on the floor. Sir, in the back, please.
Thank you for all your insights. I found it fascinating, especially because I've been involved in doing surveys of the Asian community locally as well as nationally, more in the commercial area, not as much with public policy kinds of issues. But I was curious about, in your survey that you did, what mode of data collection did you use? Was it household interviews, or there intercepts? I can't imagine it was done by telephone or anything like that, but what modality did you use to collect the data?
So this survey that I talked about earlier, the Beijing survey, was based on a list of registered residents. But these lists exclude a very large part of the population of migrants who are not registered with the state. So increasingly in China, public opinion surveys are done using a GPS random sampling, whereby China, you take a map of China, you divide China into squares of about, I'm European, so I'm thinking in square meters. I'm sorry. Certain number of X square miles. And then you randomly sample the location.
Nice.
And you send in a team. So first, you go on Google Earth, you look at the location, you see whether there are people living in those areas. And then you send in a team, and they interview everybody who is in that location.
Nice.
Face to face, door to door.
It's it's door to door. This is called GPS random sampling, and it includes about so in another survey that I used in the book. Regarding labor issues, about 28% were migrant workers. So it then includes a very large part of the population that you couldn't catch otherwise.
Well, here locally, we've also discovered high readership of newspapers among Chinese and other Asian subgroups here. Very high, much higher than whites, African Americans, or Latinos in this community. And it's very strong. And of course, the recent data from the census shows that immigrants from China have now surpassed immigrants from Mexico in the year 2014.
Is that right?
Yes, it's a very strong trend line that you see of declining immigration from Mexico going really low down, 250,000 or something from an original several million. But the Chinese immigrants have slowly been increasing, and now they surpass the number of immigrants into the U.S. as of the year 2014. So maybe there are plenty of jobs over here for journalists.
To do this, yeah.
There would always be a strong demand, I think, for newspaper readership among the Chinese. So we've got some jobs over here, I think.
Yeah, I have a queue which is getting longer, so Matt.
Oh, okay. Question about the range on a couple of the relevant variables in your study. So, first of all, in terms of the degree of marketization or privatization, if you will, of media, you mentioned that in China, the range on that is truncated in the sense that it's capped at 49%, right? In terms of private ownership, it can't exceed 50% by law. Right. So the range then is going to go from 0 to 49, but no higher. Now, it occurred to me then as you were presenting things that for the kind of conventional wisdom hypothesis, where it says that more marketization will tend to destabilize the regime, it's possible that that effect is nonlinear, and that it would only really kick in once it crosses the 50% threshold, right? Where you no longer have state majority control or party majority control. And so I wonder what you think about the effects of that variable being truncated in China, that if you did actually allow majority private shareholding in media corporations, would you see a different pattern? And then about another variable in the study, how much variation really is there in the tone and the openness that these publications can take? That is, on those that are the most, quote-unquote, free or open, to what extent do you see actual, clear, open criticism of the regime? Or is that something that is very rare to non-existent, even in the, quote-unquote, freest outlets? So how much range is there on the dependent variable there?
Right. Do you want me to collect?
Yeah, we'll just go ahead.
Respond? Okay, great. So in the cross-national analysis that I did, a lot of the other authoritarian states included cases where there was no restriction on the percentage of investment that could be owned. Especially in a lot of African states, media can be fully owned by a non-state source or a number of investors. And you find very similar results. And unfortunately, I don't have it here on the PowerPoint, but it's in the book.
Okay.
So
50% does not appear to be a magic threshold.
No, it doesn't.
Okay.
But I think in China it does make it does make a difference if we think about China maybe at some point, not soon, but maybe in 15 years or so, China may move more into the direction of what we call a dominant party regime. So right now, there are no competitive elections in China. So it's really a single party state. But a lot of states that are considered to be predominantly ruled by one party, but there is some competition. For example, Tanzania is a place like that. So a lot of places in the post-Soviet region are dominant party states, and if that should happen, the media are owned by the Chinese Communist Party, because the CCP has transformed what used to be state assets into party assets. So the media would actually be owned by a majority by the dominant party of the regime, not by the state itself. So it wouldn't give other parties access to those media as much. So I think it would matter in the Chinese case in the future. But just for this story, the story seems to be very similar in other states that are more open. And regarding criticism, so the state directives are very clear about a criticism not becoming the dominant message. So that means there's sort of an informal rule. I don't know how they, because no one does content analysis in China systematically, or at least not in media organizations, so I don't know how they measure 30%. But in their view, media can be critical about 30% of the time. And if they are critical, criticism is more acceptable if it's aimed at an institution rather than a person. So the minute a leader is mentioned by name in an investigative news report, then the report gets really sensitive. But as long as you just mention the institution itself, it's more acceptable, and then it's very frequent.
I believe, Hiroki, once you had told me that there's more freedom to criticize local officials than national officials, right? People can be more critical of
yes,
local government.
Right.
That's
Yes,
right.
okay.
And there's also also a certain strategy to it, whereby the central government systematically allows media to actually encourages media to do investigative reporting of local level officials, and more recently in the current anti-corruption campaign also to a certain extent high level officials. So it's actually encouraged to a certain extent, but only 30% of the time.
Okay.
Next question, Lee.
Okay, I have one question and some comments.
Sure.
My question is, when you talk about massage, I wonder if you actually have access to some kind of party organizational directives to specific papers saying that this and this and this. And if you do, how do you get access to that?
Yeah.
In terms of research, this is very interesting. My comments about the notion of responsive authoritarianism, and then this disparity between the Western notion of control and Chinese notion of freedom, and I'm just thinking, could it be this disparity, or the Chinese notion of greater freedom, be affected by three aspects? And first, I think could be that because China is not the West, so the notion of the traditional ideal state, in the traditional sense, has always been a responsive but authoritarian government. A government that's more paternalistic, take care of the people, hear their voice, and take care of them, rather than a representative government. And I think that notion could still have wider acceptance than that in the West. And secondly, I think could it be that even the team of journalists and editors, if they are in the middle age and older, they actually have direct experience of Maoist propaganda and authoritarian. That is, so when they speak about freedom, could it be likely that they think about the historical change, which on the long run is dramatically different? And thirdly, I think again, in terms of the role of Chinese intellectuals, which of course my work is very much focused upon, traditionally and in modern time has mostly been, very traditionally, like scholarly officials, they represent the state, but quickly in the 20th century, they migrate to a place where they play an intermediary between the state and society. So that, in other words, that they do not necessarily take a role as the voice of the public in confrontation to the state. And so, in that sense, they probably feel, even though as smart as they are, they think that is actually a positive role to play, rather than to be a confrontational voice for the public against the state. So I'm just spelling this out. That could be
great.
Explanation of why they go, oh, we're actually, not bad. We're seeing a lot more than ever before on the long run, and that's what we do as intellectuals.
Yeah, no, I would completely agree with you. Actually, the interviews I frequently came across historical references. So these three different media organization or media types, the official, the semi-official, and the commercialized, they are seen as representative of different eras of Chinese media. So, and it's very interesting because they actually correlate with the years in which they are founded. So these official papers, they tend to go back to the 1950s, still exist. They are also somewhat associated with the Mao years and how journalism was done at the time, which journalists describe as they use an expression standing for filling water into an open teapot. So the state fills your ideas inside your head, sort of, so to speak. And then you have the semi-official papers, which are representative of the 1980s, which are described as a bird in a cage. So you can sing a song, but you still see the barriers. And then the 1990s, the commercialized papers are described as a period where where there's a flying kite in the sky, and the leash is held by the Chinese Communist Party. So yes, absolutely, there's definitely historical references, and I really think that people's historical memories, have a very strong say in seeing the glass as half full as opposed to seeing it as half empty. I also think that you're right. Shi Tianjian's last book is about political culture in China, and he describes very clearly how the Chinese public expects the Chinese state to take on certain responsibilities, such as, for example, educating the public, which then, in the conversations that the journalists have with the propaganda officials, make, or think potentially they could play a role in convincing the editors that they should actually give in, and that they, to a certain extent, even though they bring certain issues to the attention of the leadership, ultimately, for example, in the stock market crisis, if the leadership says we need to make sure that that there's no major crisis, that this situation doesn't get out of hand, then that editors, in my experience at least, have been very willing to collaborate regarding the message, kind of agreeing, yes, we should make sure that we don't that we kind of calm down public opinion. So yeah, absolutely. I think these are all important points. Regarding how you get information about directives, so in the book there is a whole chapter about directives and how the directives make it into actual newspapers, and how do you get access to them? Well, you can, in the interviews, if somebody tells you how the directive is called, you can Google it or Baidu it in China, and you can find a lot of them online. But you need to know the title or the headline. So that's one.
It's public information. I mean, you can access.
No, these are they're NEPU internal documents, but a lot of the internal documents somehow leak online.
It's a semi-gray area.
Yeah, but as long as you can find them online, so I try to cite these documents if they are publicly available to a certain extent. But a lot of these directives also make it through journalists that have contacts outside of China, and are then published by some of the journalist organizations. And Xiaoqiang at the China Digital Times at Berkeley collects them. And so if you're interested in this, even he publishes an online paper called China Digital Times in Chinese and English, and a lot of the directives are quoted in China Digital Times. So a lot of this information is, if you know where to find it, you can get it, but it doesn't show you the full picture. So you always lose some information, obviously.
We'll go down the line here, sir, please.
Oh, I just had one quick question about your samples, what you drew from when you were making that positive word minus negative word, or the total. Were you using basically news articles, op-eds, or like what were you limiting to that?
Oh, okay. So there is a dictionary that psychologists have developed. It's called the General Inquirer Dictionary. It was developed at Harvard University. It's an English a dictionary of the English language that lists words that tend to be positive and words that tend to be negative. And a couple of researchers, linguists in Taiwan have translated the General Inquirer. So they didn't directly translate it, but they sort of tried to apply it to the Chinese language. And I've used that dictionary in a computer-aided text analysis. So what that means in practice is that I wish it would be so easy that you can just plug it into a computer and then it gives you the results and tells you, these articles tend to be positive and these tend to be negative. But unfortunately, you still have to read all of these articles and check whether the program on average picks out the right tone and codes it correctly, and then you have to constantly adjust the dictionary. But it's a combination of using that dictionary plus a content analysis program called Yoshi Coder. It's a free software where you can systematically analyze content of any text in different languages. So you could compare Arabic with Chinese, with Japanese, with English. It's able to do sort of cross-language text analysis.
I think just to follow up the question, as I understood it, was: are you looking just at straightforward news articles?
Only news articles. Only news articles.
Not op-ed.
No,
not
that's
the
right.
sports
Oh,
page.
sorry. Yes.
Yeah, you're fine. No, that was really interesting as well. Yeah.
No, really news. News articles.
Okay, next slide, June.
Yes, I have a question. How do generational difference work here? So, did you notice that different age groups respond differently to your research questions? And I guess the answer that I'm seeking is how the China's future, the future generations, right? So because I noticed that some of students sitting here, Chinese students sitting in here, nodding their heads all the time. So this China obviously sending the most students to the States and to the world compared to any other countries. So those students have these students will have such different view when they go back to their country, especially they will be mostly in Beijing, which then you did your most of research. So what I'm trying to see is how, as the generation changes, how does this gonna changes, and how this will also influence the China's future. So So how for the media relations and the media relations with the state will change the Chinese future as generation changes?
That's an excellent question. I wish I had the answer. It's always difficult to predict China's future. You must be wrong. China always surprises me. But so let me just. So I don't know anybody who's working or is doing systematic research on these questions. Although I think these would be great questions for research. But just based on my personal observations of working with Chinese students abroad, who oftentimes now do not undergo the traditional, what's called the Gaokao system, the civil service examination system. Increasingly in China, in high schools, you have the option of whether you want to follow the traditional Chinese route. So that means you prepare for the civil service examination, and then your score is compared to everybody else at a national level, or you're prepared for studying abroad. So in these schools, I've been to one of these high schools. To me, what's really amazing is they don't learn about Chinese history anymore. They have the English. Did you go to one of those schools? Yeah. So right. So you have an American curriculum basically being prepared for the SATs. Which is just amazing to me, right? And inside China, and then a lot of these students come to the United States.
Come to my class.
Yes, exactly. Or they go to Canada.
Chinese history.
All of a sudden, 10 of them show up.
Exactly. So what I have, just my personal observation of talking to the students is that if they go abroad and they experience an uncensored internet environment, that they tend to get very upset when they go to China and they cannot go to their Facebook pages. They run into all sorts of issues to keep in touch with their friends, but also they are just more sensitive to what information is censored, because as long as you are inside the system, you don't know exactly what the information is that you don't know, right? So it creates some dissatisfaction, but it doesn't, in my experience, it doesn't go so far that the students I talk to actually become very critical of the Chinese political system. So even though there may be some dissatisfaction regarding press freedom, still there is sort of a sense that the current political system is the best for the current situation in China. So it doesn't breed support for democracy, in my opinion.
Okay, we have about 12 more minutes. We've got 5 people on the queue, so please try to keep questions brief.
Yeah.
So please.
Sure. Sorry, I had a quick question, kind of building off of the age group issue. You mentioned earlier on one of the slides a comparison between the People's Daily and the Beijing Youth, I believe?
Youth Daily, yes.
I was just wondering, because on your scale, the Youth Daily newspaper was a bit more open and a bit more free from government censorship, could they, and if they knew their target audience was a younger group, would they be more inclined to be more sensational with their news outlets, especially considering like the younger demographic probably would be more impressionable? Because also even after the synchronization, you can still see that they tend to lean more towards the negative side.
Mm-hmm. So the name is a little misleading. Mm-hmm. So Beijing Youth Daily, it is called Youth Daily because it is affiliated with the Chinese Youth League, but its readers are actually not younger readers. Okay. But there is indeed a relationship between relying on greater advertising and investment and dramatized content. And that's often in Chinese censorship, the argument the government makes is don't dramatize. You should, instead of soft news, you should produce hard news and take out all the emotional jargon in your newspaper articles. Yeah.
Question on your selection for the analysis of the media type. I'm familiar with the Russian case much better than the Chinese case, and it seems like in the Russian case there is a variation not only in the extent to which state censors a particular media type, like newspapers, but also there is a substantial variation in the way it censors different media types. So the most restrictive space is in the television. You don't have any access for the opposition politicians. In newspapers there is less restriction, but it's also pretty restrictive, and the least restrictive is radio. And in radio there are several radio stations where you can actually say whatever you want. You have all the opposition politicians on there and so on. So I was wondering whether you can apply that, whether this similar dynamic exists in China.
Absolutely. And it's the same pattern. Television, most restricted, newspapers and radio, the least restricted. And then followed by the internet.
Any idea why that is? Why that is? Or in either case? I was curious.
So in China, the reason is just the number of people who are getting information through these.
Just numbers.
Yes, exactly. Except that the internet is an outlier because increasingly a large part of the Chinese population has access to the internet, but I think their communication technology kind of gets in the way. It's much harder to control.
Right. I also think about the number of outlets you'd have to police, right? Because if there's only like a few national television networks, that's easy.
That's right.
Only 1 or 2 newspapers per city, but how many radio stations in every city, and then how many websites? So it keeps getting bigger and bigger. Policing, that's great.
Bandless grows every year.
So I think it's really interesting that traditional media still dominates the landscape in China, but certainly, especially since 2008, the Sichuan earthquake, we've seen a rise in the social media, especially shaping the narrative. I think of Weixin, Weibo. Could you talk a bit? Sorry, this is way off topic from your research.
No, not at all. My research project is about social media.
Right. Yeah. So how that's sort of shaping the way that the state is able to control the narrative that's out there.
So Weibo is the Chinese version of Twitter. And what's very interesting about Weibo and how Weibo was able to establish itself was that it, on the one hand, it empowers citizens because it makes internet users, into journalists, into the producers of information. So you can, on the one hand, you can see it as a tool to kind of empower citizens. But in China, Weibo was able, the company Sina was able to establish this communication technology because they argue that it's also a tool to guide public opinion, and so that goes again back to this idea of, on the one hand, giving people the freedom to voice their opinions and using media as an input mechanism, but on the other hand, being able to manipulate the message. And there are various ways in which the technology creates restrictions for messages to become really viral. And also the state has, I don't know if you're aware of it, last year there's a new regulation that people who spread rumors and messages where they personally make a profit from, that exceed 500 posts, or I think the number is about 5,000 viewers, that you can be fined for it. So in the worst case scenario, you would be put into prison, but it has happened in a few cases, but generally you are fined. So there are certain ways in which, again, these rules and regulations are also imposed on social media. And something that's very interesting is that, I don't know for sure about Weibo, but a lot of social media in China give government institutions access to an API. An API is a technology where censors can directly see they can observe what users are publishing, and they can delete information.
You have to sign up with your real name too.
Sorry.
You have to sign up with your real name as well, or it has to at least be linked to a phone number.
No, it is no longer enforced. But there was a big outrage about it. Yes, there was a big opposition towards it.
Sandy?
When I was traveling in China in late 2007, one of the things I was told was that tourists in hotels that cater to tourists have access to TV channels that the general Chinese population do not. But one of the most interesting things I found, like just in reading the China Daily News in English, was that it seemed that the Chinese government had started to use the language of traditional Confucianism in order to get across what it was trying to achieve in its policy. So concepts like harmony and balance began cropping up a lot. And then when I went to tourist sites, turns out that the Chinese government was putting a lot of effort into educating the Chinese population about the history of the country. So there were more domestic Chinese at these tourist sites than actual Western tourists. And I'm just wondering, to what extent has the government sort of used this kind of rhetoric as a directive to, you know, the more freer media in the way in which they actually use language to attach to this Chinese past, which the government seems to be actually interested in fostering. But then when you talk about the Chinese students who are being educated about Western history, not Chinese history, there seems a disconnect there.
No, I have to clarify that. I was in our compulsory courses in China in high school. First, we have to learn the Chinese history, from where we are from and where we're going, and then we come to the Western history, including all the countries, maybe America, Australia, Europe, from the ancient Greek, Rome. Yeah, so all of it we have been taught, and even under examinations we did. Yeah. But you know why we some students they have to learn the American history because it's AT. They have to, if they want to come to the US, they have to take that course examination. So that's why.
Sure. Well, one book I can recommend if you're interested in language, in the power of language, not only in media but also documents in China, is Doing Things with Words in Chinese Politics. And the author is Schönhals, Schoenhals. And it's a very short book, and really focusing on how the use of certain terminology is strategically used to legitimize the power of the CCP in China. So perhaps of interest. It doesn't specifically focus on Confucianism, but there is a literature out there about how Confucian culture is part of propaganda for not aimed at Chinese citizens, but aimed at foreigners. So, for example, tourists who are sitting in hotel rooms in China and then having access to CCTV in English and so forth. So these kinds of media are specifically aimed at educating foreigners or the outside world about China, and they use a lot of Confucian ideas because they think it makes China more popular abroad.
There was a book published by Princeton a few years ago which talked about the increasing influence of Confucianism inside Chinese society too.
Right.
Well, I'm sure the Princeton book is interesting. I'm sure the Schönhals book is fascinating, but we're all going to read your book first. Fabulous topic and a wonderful presentation. Please join me in thanking Daniela. If you're not on our mailing list, please get in touch with us so you can learn about future events. Our website is also packed full of good information about upcoming programming. Have a great day.